Welcome to the Equal Opportunities Committee, the 27th meeting of 2013. Please set any electronic devices to flight mode or off. I'd like to start with introductions. At the table we have our clerking and research team, together with our budget advisor, official reporters and broadcasting services. Around the room we're supported by the Security Office, and we don't have any observers in the gallery at the moment. My name is Margaret McCulloch and I'm the committee convener, and I now invite members and witnesses to introduce themselves in turn, starting here on my right.
I'm Nick Watson from the University of Glasgow.
Marco Biaggi, MSP for Edinburgh Central and Deputy Convener.
John Mason, MSP for Glasgow Shettleston.
Morning. John Finney, MSP Highlands and Islands.
Alec Johnston, Member for North East Scotland.
Good morning. Christian Allard, MSP for North East of Scotland.
Lloyd Martin, MSP for Central Scotland.
Yvonne Strachan from the Scottish Government.
John Swinney, Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth.
Paul Tyrer from the Scottish Government.
Thank you very much. The first agenda item today is a decision on taking business in private. You're asked to agree to take consideration of your work programme at item 3 on today's agenda in private. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed. Thank you. The second agenda item is an evidence session to support our scrutiny of the Scottish Government's draft budget for 2014-15. Can I start by asking the Cabinet Secretary and, well, you've already introduced yourself, to give us any opening remarks, please?
Thank you, Convener. I welcome this opportunity to discuss the draft budget and particularly the work we're undertaking to incorporate equality within the budget process. The draft budget for 2014-15 maintains the course set out in the Spending Review 2011 and continues our track record of effective stewardship of Scotland's public finances. We continue to face challenging economic conditions which have a direct impact on our economic growth, employment, public services and in turn the well-being of our communities. In this difficult environment, we've taken budgetary decisions which position us to respond to these challenges, and these, alongside our programme for government and economic strategy, provide a robust framework in which our decisions have been taken. The draft budget contains support for measures which contribute to economic growth, the protection of employment and through the social wage to the reduction of pressure on household incomes. At the same time, it also maintains a strong focus on shifting spend and practice to prevention and early intervention and to delivering wider public service reform. Within these broad strategic priorities, we are also taking forward measures to address issues of employment, to mitigate the worst effects of welfare reform, and we have maintained our strong support for equality, the third sector and our communities. Underpinning our approach is the recognition that our success as a nation depends on building a society in which people achieve, regardless of their background, and where the barriers to participation and opportunity are removed. Inequality detracts from our economic performance and our social well-being. I understand that the committee is taking a focus in its scrutiny of the draft budget this year on the question of disability. There are, of course, deep-rooted and long-standing issues of disability inequality in our society, which are reflected in the barriers which exist to disabled people being able to realise their full potential. It is important that these barriers are tackled, and I look forward to exploring some of these issues with the committee this morning. In the current climate, we know that some people are experiencing the impact of economic recession and public spending pressures more acutely than others. The UK welfare reforms, for example, threaten the living standards of many and will have a particularly devastating effect on disabled people. Unemployment blights the circumstances and opportunities for a large number of young people, and there remain barriers to participation and progress within the labour market for different equality groups. I am aware that there is real concern that without intervention existing inequalities may deepen and the disparities and disadvantage faced by some may become entrenched. How we spend our money, therefore, is all the more important at this time. As part of our budget preparations, we have drawn on evidence and equality analysis to make the most informed decisions that we can. This equality budget statement is our fifth, and it demonstrates our ongoing commitment to embedding equality in our budget process and to making year-on-year improvements in how we do this. I am committed to continuing to improve our approach to budget setting and equality analysis. As we progress with the reform of public services and with the shift to prevention, so the challenges around equality analysis and assessment are likely to grow. We are aware of the difficulties in relation to data and information, and although we will continue to improve the availability of data, we also need to explore what more can be done to better understand the impacts of key issues and measures being taken. We will consider how we can best approach these challenges together with our partners. In particular, I will look for guidance from the Equality Budget Advisory Group and will be grateful for the input of the committee as to how we might improve the process and this statement. I would like to record my thanks to the committee for its interest and continued support in seeking to improve how Scotland strives to be a fairer and more equal society, and look forward to discussing these issues this morning.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to now invite John Mason to ask the first question.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, you touched in your opening remarks, Cabinet Secretary, on your recognition that when there's so much competition for jobs, that disabled people might be the ones who are increasingly disadvantaged compared to normal times. And when we had witnesses along, the issue kind of came up quite a lot that, you know, we here, i.e. the government and the Parliament, can make lots of good decisions and want all the best things. But once it all filters down to the ground, the danger is it's not actually happening. And one of the examples given was modern apprenticeships, where it was suggested to us that only 0.5%, in fact less than 0.5% of all places had gone to disabled people. And I mean, I don't know what the answer to this is, and I just would like your comments and thinking about that. I mean, for one, we don't want to be always telling local health boards and local councils exactly how they should do things, and yet our intentions, for example, to help disabled people and have some money going towards disabled people doesn't always seem to work out in practice. Can you comment?
Yeah, I think the general observation I would make in response to Mr Mason's point is that you know, I think the data, in a sense, illustrates the nature of the problem that we face here. That in terms of the employment rate for people without disabilities was 79.7% over the course of the last year. The employment rate for people aged 16 to 64 with a disability was 42.3%. So there is clearly an underlying disparity within the economy about economic participation and participation in the labour market from people who have disabilities. Now, there will be some people with disabilities who it's just impossible to participate in the labour market, and we must recognise that. But I think the concerning point about the data that I've just shared with the committee is that the employment rate for people with disabilities was actually down by 1.6 percentage points over the year, when the wider employment position was stronger across all cohorts. And I think that illustrates the fact that when we face economic difficulties, access to the labour market becomes more difficult for those individuals who already face difficulties in gaining access to the labour market. And I think the way in which we can tackle that is to ensure that we take forward a very supportive approach to assisting people into employment as much as we possibly can do. One of the points that I'm increasingly focusing the efforts of government on in the field of employment is in taking forward a very person-centred approach, that we recognise that each individual who is not active in the labour market will have different issues and different considerations and different obstacles they have to overcome to become participants in the labour market. So therefore, we have to design interventions that are centred on the needs of those individuals. One of the things that I'm concerned about, though, is that that work may be undermined by the kind of general assertion on welfare reform that people have to be treated in a very similar fashion in terms of their eligibility to participate in the labour market, and some of our person-centred work may be knocked off course by the generalities of welfare reform. But that to me is the key aspect of how we tailor support. And I spend a lot of my time visiting projects around the country which are often anchored within the third sector, frequently focused on employability. I actually was at a venture last night in Clackmannanshire and Alloa, where I was discussing a range of third sector issues with local organisations, but one organisation was recounting to me the experience they've had in supporting people who are far removed from the labour market to gain access to the labour market, and their method of support was a very person-centred approach and had very good results as a consequence. And I certainly would take great encouragement from initiatives of that type. So that person-centred approach is crucial. I think the final point I'd make is in relation to the position on modern apprenticeships, and in a sense, the point that Mr Mason raises is both a strength and a weakness of the modern apprenticeship programme. The modern apprenticeship programme is an employment-based programme, so therefore, by its nature, to participate in it, there has to be an employment connection. And if it is more difficult for people, so that's a strength of the programme, in my opinion, but if disabled people have more difficulty finding employment, then they will find more difficulty obtaining modern apprenticeships. And I think we are recognising that issue, and Skills Development Scotland are actively exploring how we are able to make it more practical, more tangible for people with disabilities to participate in the modern apprenticeship programme, recognising that point that I've just made.
Okay, well, I appreciate that's a full answer. I mean, you mentioned right at the end then Skills Development Scotland. I mean, do you think, are they the main player in this? Is it them that we should be looking to kind of change things, or should we be going directly to employers and saying, you know, you've got to think a bit more seriously about taking on disabled people, or, you know, how do you think we tackle this?
It's certainly in terms of trying to tackle characteristics of the modern apprenticeship programme to improve the opportunities for people with disabilities, then yes, Skills Development Scotland will be a crucial organisation in that process, and they will be very much involved in engineering what approach what can be achieved in that respect. But it's not all just about Skills Development Scotland. Employers, and in that I also accept public sector employers, have got a significant role to play in this exercise into the bargain. And I think that's a particular issue that all employers have to take to heart, and certainly within the wider communications that we take forward on aspects of the modern apprenticeship programme, and wider questions of employability for people with disabilities, that is a message that has to be advanced.
I mean, I think we've sometimes felt in this committee that actually some employers are willing to take on disabled people, but maybe aren't aware of all the support that might be available. Would that be your kind of judgment as well?
I think one of the things that concerns me is that I think we don't make it easy for employers to participate in many of our employment schemes, because we've got there's so much information, there's so many options, there's so many choices. You know, I was down the borders early on last week, meeting a range of textile companies, and one of the employers there, made the kind of that sort of remark which is always of concern to me. I'm running my business, I'm busy, I don't have time to keep up with all what you lot are getting up to, and it's a pretty fair point. So we have to connect and link up many of these propositions much more effectively to meet the needs of employers. Now, there will be many examples of good projects around the country where, particularly based in the third sector environment, and that's why I have invested so much time, effort and resources in trying to strengthen the third sector in Scotland, that can accommodate people with disabilities in terms of the labour market. And if I look at the growing number of active social enterprises within Scotland, more and more of these organisations are coming together to provide a sustainable, remunerative employment opportunity for people with disabilities, and I think that's a welcome process around the country.
Thank you for that, John. I'd like to bring in Christian and then Yvonne, but before that I'd like to ask a question about the modern apprentices myself. Is there funding available for if employers want to employ someone who may be visually impaired or hearing impaired? to provide for like, a scribe or some support for that individual for the first 2 or 3 months. But I know there's funding available, or there was funding available from Job Centre Plus when they were doing the previous New Deal programmes, and they had a pocket of money. But I don't know, is there money available for that through Skills Development Scotland?
I'm not certain the channel would be Skills Development Scotland. I would think the most relevant channel would be the Access to Work programme, which, if my memory serves me correct, is funded by the United Kingdom Government. But it would be, and it's essentially recognising that issue of tailored support, which is related to what I don't want to express it as being part of the benefit system, because it's not, but it's essentially about how you remove barriers to employment through particular targeted interventions. And the channel of support, I think, would be the best one to deal with the circumstances. I think is relevant to your point, Convener, would be the Access to Work programme.
I don't think a lot of employers are actually probably aware of that funding stream, so it would be beneficial.
I think that would be a very fair observation, Convener, but certainly from my experience of the Access to Work programme in knowing individuals who have received support through that, what at the outset might feel like, without knowing very much about it, a cumbersome, difficult, hard to access programme is actually very straightforward. And I think I would in my experience of the Access to Work programme, I would compliment it on its straightforwardness and its ease of access for people. And I think also, in my experience, a pretty, as you would hope, sympathetic tone to its decision-making structure and style.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Christian.
Yes, just a supplementary on this question. Cabinet Secretary, I'm quite pleased to hear that you want to explore further the reason why modern apprenticeship schemes are not working for people with disability. But I wonder if you could explore as well why is it that? Is it maybe the reason is because people with disability will choose other routes? For example, you talked about the third sector than this kind of schemes. So it would be good to have some research about this.
I think there's there will be a range of ways in which people with disabilities access the labour market and maintain their activity levels. And one of the things, there's a pretty significant point in the welfare reform agenda which troubles me around the question of how volunteering activity is treated, because there will be, I know from my own constituency experience, there are people with disabilities who are able to participate in volunteering activity in different local ventures, often social enterprises. They are able and capable of doing that. But if that was to be perceived as being essentially demonstrating their fitness for work, it would be a completely different question, because they wouldn't be fit. There's no way they would be fit for work. There's no way they'd be able to do without their benefits and assume full-time employment, because their disability was such that it would never enable them to do so. And I'm concerned that in the approach that's been taken to the welfare reform programme, assumptions may be made about what is the capability of individuals, which I think might stretch those individuals, particularly people, less so people with physical disabilities, but people with mental health issues and concerns. I think it's a particular issue in that respect. But I do think, and I said in my opening statement, that the data in this area is not perfect. So I'll certainly explore the suggestion that's been made by Mr Allard today to determine what more we can detect about the different routes that individuals take to be active, because there may well be other approaches that are taken other than signing up for a modern apprenticeship. Well, there are, of course. There's signing up for modern apprenticeships, there's participation in college courses, there's participation in third sector activity, and there will be mainstream employment. So there will be a range of these options, but I don't think we have sufficient detail to address the issues that have been raised by Mr Allard this morning.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Yvonne.
Thanks. I just want to again follow up on the modern apprenticeship scheme. We spoke last year at the budget process about the modern apprenticeship scheme and how barriers are put in place for females, specifically to achieve levels 3, 4 and 5. And you said that obviously you would take that back and look at ways to adapt the scheme in order that that might not be the case going forward, given we've now got evidence to suggest that there is a barrier for disabled people to enter the scheme. I was wondering that as much as its good intentions are there, given its limited advantages to certain groups in our society, would you look at looking at a different scheme that might benefit more people with the money that you're putting into the modern apprenticeship scheme?
I think that the modern apprenticeship programme, principally because of and this is why I kind of volunteered the point that it's its strength and it's also its weakness, is the point that I made to John Mason earlier on, that I do think the great strength of the modern apprenticeship programme is its link to employment and the necessity of all places to be employed. That brings employers into the arena of dealing with training requirements and education requirements and skill development requirements. It also ensures that a high quality level of training is actually provided in an employment setting. So I think but I do accept that the nature of that then makes it more difficult for people with disabilities to access the programme. I certainly am willing to consider what other ventures that we might be able to bring forward to assist people with disabilities accessing the labour market. I wouldn't be supportive of diverting modern apprenticeship resource activity away from what it's doing, because there's still a clear and discernible requirement for significant modern apprenticeship capability within the economy today, and it's a very clear reflection of the feedback we're receiving from employers. So I'm keen to explore the point that's raised by Yvonne McMahon, but not at the expense of the existing modern apprenticeship programme.
Does anyone have any more questions about modern apprenticeships? No. Can we now move on to, it's Yvonne would like to ask some questions about self-directed support.
We heard an evidence from the participants who, in principle, like all of us in the committee, are supportive of the SDS bill and the choices that allows individuals to make for their care packages. But we also heard an evidence that people were now finding it more difficult to access funds for those packages, saying that their funding had been reduced. And I was just wondering if you had any comments to make on that. Were you aware of that being taking place already?
The funding lines on self-directed support are basically in 13-14, 17 million, and then 14-15 and 15-16, 12 million respectively. And I know there has been some concern expressed about the fact that the two further years are at 12 million, whereas the current financial year is at 17 million. This essentially was always the planned rollout of this expenditure. In 2013-14, it was recognised that the level of support that we would put in place would be essentially a peak year, because we were introducing the Self-Directed Support Act, and that the 12 million figure was essentially the baseline for the ongoing period. Now, what this and essentially the additional resources available in 13-14 is essentially to build the capacity to ensure that the Self-Directed Support Act can be applied on an ongoing basis in a sustainable way. I think the approach of self-directed support, whereas it's an approach which is absolutely consistent with one of the major streams of the government's public service reform agenda, which is about making public services more person-centred. It puts much more choice and planning and flexibility into the hands of the individual who is the recipient of self-directed support, and it enables that individual to essentially configure the arrangements that they have to meet their requirements. Now, clearly, we will always monitor the utilisation of those resources and monitor the extent to which the resources are satisfying demand amongst individuals for self-directed support. But I certainly haven't, I've not seen any systemic information that suggests to me that the financial plans that we've made are in any way inadequate in meeting the challenge.
I think obviously that's something that we heard in evidence that people were worried about the impacts of welfare reform, UK Government's welfare reform. They were also worried about the Independent Living Fund coming to an end, and so that resource failing as well. So all of those things combined, and only to rely on SDS was becoming the problem. So I think in a wider sense that was a clear problem there. But I think following on from that, we heard in evidence as well that because individuals were becoming responsible for their own PAs, there seemed to be a way where the PAs were going to 0-hour contracts and losing their entitlement to sick pay and holiday pay. So we're just wondering if you were aware that that was happening to PAs that were directly employed through the SDS bills now.
If I could just make a remark about the Independent Living Fund, this will be responsibility for the fund will be devolved in 2015, and ministers here have made it clear that the £50 million that we expect to be devolved will continue to be applied to an independent living fund within Scotland. So I hope that gives some clarity on that point. In relation to the point on PA support, I'm not aware of those issues, but I'll certainly explore them. My view is that personal assistants are absolutely essential to providing the support that individuals require. It's an essential part of making the regime successful. And there is a need for those individuals to be appropriately rewarded and certainly to receive the support that they require to undertake the work that they're involved in. So I'll certainly explore the issues that have been raised on that question.
That would be helpful. Just on the Independent Living Fund, just to go back to that, I think the concerns of the evidence that we've heard is that, although welcomed, if the money is devolved and it is welcomed, it wouldn't be for new recipients because it's not going up, and so there was a concern about that. So I'm just wondering if that would be addressed. So again, it would be additional finance. I accept that budgets are tight, but
I think this gets us into the territory, and I completely accept the importance of the point that's been raised. It gets us into the territory of our ability to mitigate the effects of welfare reform. The committee will be familiar with the actions that the government has taken in relation to the devolution of council tax benefit. Council tax benefit was abolished in the United Kingdom, and a sum of money was devolved to Scotland to deal with the ongoing cohort of individuals who would clearly need to receive council tax benefit or have a significant impact on their income. But 100% of the amount of money wasn't devolved, 90% of it was devolved, and there was no indexation of the sum of money involved. So we've had to fill the gap in partnership with our local authority colleagues to make sure that people were not experiencing a 10% cut in their council tax benefit. So that the point that Yvonne McMahon raises about the Independent Living Fund is another example, and we will have to consider when this happens in 2015 what other steps that we can take. But I think I've been pretty clear with Parliament that I think it is, well, I've been very clear with Parliament, it will not be possible for the government in Scotland to ameliorate and make good all of the impacts of welfare reform on individuals. It simply will be a financial impossibility, but we will give consideration to the issues that are raised at the time.
Obviously, you raised welfare reform, and I'll have a question later on about that, but I don't want to preempt my colleagues' questions on that. So if I could just stick to service care or care service charging by local authorities. We've heard in evidence that on average charging is now 12.6% up over the last 2 years. I'm just wondering if you're aware of that figure and if you had any plans to address that, given that some local authorities are now charging 100% of the spare income allowance to individuals.
These are matters for local government to take forward. They have the responsibility to exercise any charging approach that they decide to take forward. Clearly, it's within their competence to consider these issues, and the Accounts Commission has published material today which relates to some of these questions and which considers the degree to which there is differential attitudes taken towards charging for particular types of care services in different parts of the country, and the Accounts Commission report considers that issue this morning.
You wouldn't be surprised that I asked the same question of the witnesses that appeared in front of the committee and asked them if they thought that the charges were happening as a result of the council tax freeze in order that local authorities have to raise revenue in some way. Did they find that to be the case? And if the Cabinet Secretary could bear with me a minute, I just wanted to read just 3 quick quotes from the witnesses and then get your opinion on that. So Bill Scott from Inclusion Scotland said, "I think that the freeze is being funded partially through increased charges on disabled people. Put simply, you cannot have an indefinite freeze funded by an additional but standstill 70 million each year that does not take inflation into account and hope that services will remain unchanged and undiminished. Local authorities have only limited means of increasing their revenue from charges, and disabled people are an easy target." Pam Duncan from the Independent Living in Scotland said, "I echo much of what Bill has said. This is very much about priorities. Like Bill, we see the council tax as a regressive form of taxation, but we still believe that you need to unfreeze it because the freeze is not sustainable." And finally, Tressa Burke from Glasgow Disability Alliance said, "I echo what Pam Duncan has said. We believe in a fair and progressive form of tax, but we cannot sustain the council tax freeze, which has meant that for the past 7 years, apart from disabled people, nobody has paid any money towards what are rising costs. We feel that social care should be free at the point of delivery." Just wondering if you had any comments to make on the witnesses' statements.
But clearly, the witnesses expressed their views and their assessments of these issues, and I respect the points of view that they put forward, but I don't agree with them. As the committee will be familiar, the Scottish Government has fully funded the council tax freeze at a level of £70 million per annum, and that was a point again made by the chair of the Accounts Commission in dealing with some of the questions around this point that I heard on the radio on my way into Parliament this morning. On the £70 million, some years that was set. I set that in 2008-9 to deal with the an inflationary increase that could have been conceived on the council tax. And of course, over the course of the last few years, inflation has varied, and sometimes it's been lower than 3.2%. So I could make the argument that the government was actually giving local authorities more money than they required to freeze the council tax, because inflation was not as high as the 3.2% which I envisaged when I set out the £70 million support in 2008-9. The next point I would make is that when we look at this question, we cannot just segment parts of the local authority funding settlement and say that that decision has led to particular increases in charges. We have to look at the global settlement for local government and look at it within the context of the overall financial position that the Scottish Government finds itself in. And in this respect, it's vital that the committee considers these statistics. Between 2007-8 and 2012-13, the resources within the Scottish Government's control increased by 6.4%. Over the same period, local government's budget increased by 8.9%. So in short, whilst the budget that I control and have overall responsibility for was increasing by 6.4%, local government budgets were actually increasing by 8.9% higher than the budget increase that I was dealing with over that period in time. So I think the argument that suggests that somehow the local authorities have not been properly supported and have then had to go to a charging approach is ill-founded on two counts. One is that the council tax freeze has been fully funded by the Scottish Government in each year. And secondly, local authority finance has increased at a faster rate than Scottish Government money has increased at. And I think that it's essential that that context, the issue about charging is considered within that particular context.
You won't be surprised to hear that I don't agree with your analysis, Cabinet Secretary, but I was just wondering then, if that is your point, and obviously you've demonstrated that, why do you think that the charges are going up by 12.6% on average in the last 2 years?
Well, these are decisions that are taken by individual local authorities, and the point that the Chair of the Accounts Commission was making on the radio this morning was that there is significant variation in the fact that one authority will have charges at one level and another authority will have them at significantly different levels. Now, that is the right of local government, and you know, I would be the first to defend the right of local government to take decisions properly within its own competence. But I think it's important that local authorities demonstrate, as the Chair of the Accounts Commission has made clear in the report that has been published this morning, the basis upon which a charging regime has been taken forward.
Just one final point on that then. You said yourself, you know, one local authority will charge one thing, another will do it. So you don't envisage taking that under Scottish Government control at this point. And I say that because we've heard that that's a barrier for employment opportunities, that some people who are living in a local authority don't wish to move for a job because they might get another local authority who charge more for the same care package. So things to address that, be it under Scottish Government control or be it an investigation into that matter. Do you envisage that in the future?
I think the you know, local government is, and you know, I think it'd be interesting to hear if the committee was to take evidence from my colleagues in local government. I'd be interested to hear what their reaction to the proposition of the Finance Secretary taking control of local authority charging. I can imagine that would be not particularly warmly welcomed, if I can understate their reaction to that. So you know, there are proper and legitimate roles for local authorities to design their local services and to decide on the charging mechanism. So I have no plans to take that under the government's responsibility. I'd also make the point that I think it really is important when we are increasingly looking at a much more extensive integration of public services at local level, so that the type of support packages that are put in place for individuals who require assistance and support are now increasingly informed by cross-working and collaboration between different public bodies, that some of the issues that are raised by Yvonne today can be addressed by the way in which we design person-centred services at local level, which meet the needs not just of how an individual is supported by a local authority, but by the health service and by other public bodies, and how we do that in a fashion that's compatible with the self-directed support regime in which the government is, of which the government is very strongly supportive.
Thank you very much. We'll move on now to children with disabilities, and Marco Biaggi would like to ask you some questions, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. Childcare and services for children is another one of those broad headings where high priority accorded at this level in Parliament doesn't always filter down to those who are most excluded, in particular disabled children. And there's a report recently from the Scottish Commissioner for Children and Young People which suggests that disabled children are having difficulty in terms of the services that they are receiving from local authorities. Is there any spending allocation that you can point to in the budget that will follow through in support for disabled children and young people, or is this another area where local authority priorities are going to be at the forefront?
There will be. I think it's important to answer this question within the context of the approach that's been taken to support children in our society, and essentially it comes where the government's approach is anchored is in the GIRFIC agenda, getting it right for every child, and that's an agenda which is not just the property of the government; it's very broadly and emphatically endorsed by our wider public service partners, and indeed the work that's been taken forward under GIRFIC is actually one of the areas where I think we are making probably the fastest progress in developing public services on the integrated model that I've talked about. In May, I attended the learning session of the Early Years Collaborative at the Exhibition Centre in Glasgow, and the most encouraging thing I saw on that visit was there's about 800 odd public servants from all across the country were there, and there was a storyboard for each community planning partnership area, all 32 of them around the country. Every one of them was able to demonstrate solid progress on the integration of public services at local level, consistent with the GIRFIC agenda. So what that does is it inevitably brings together the funding streams that are available through different public bodies to support the needs of an individual child and to make sure that child's needs are met. And fundamentally at the heart of getting it right for every child is that we've got to get it right for every child. So, and one child's needs will be different from another child's needs. So drawing together that planning and focus support is essential to ensure that we properly meet the needs of young people. So some of this support will come through the change fund that the government has put in place and which will continue during 2014-15. Some of it will come through local authority and health service budgets. Some of it will come through the work of third sector organisations. In terms of specific budget lines, there are particular measures being brought forward in terms of the budget lines on children's rights, on getting it right for every child, on early learning and childcare, on the support that we put in place for looked after children. We also have the financial support that we put in place for some of our strategic partners in relation to the support that they take forward to assist young people. There is also the family trust, the family fund trust, which is available to provide support to disabled children. So there are a range of different mechanisms within the budgets which are put in place, but the approach will be driven by the GIRFIC agenda and how that draws together the work of all of our local authority and health service partners.
And more broadly, with regard to childcare, how would you characterise the balance between the universalism of approach and the importance of extra provision, extra effort for those that are most excluded, in particular disabled children?
There will be, in terms of the commitment which the government will move to in 14-15 of 600 hours for 3 and 4-year-olds and looked after 2-year-olds, there will be care packages in place that will provide greater support than that commitment for if there's a disabled 3-year-old, there may well be a care package which provides greater childcare than just simply the 600 hours commitment the government will fulfil during 2014-15 in partnership with local government. So there will be other arrangements that can meet those needs.
Thank you very much. We'll move on now to the topic of third sector support, and Alex Johnson would like to ask the Cabinet Secretary some questions.
Thank you very much, Convener. We are all aware of the wonderful work that's done in this area by voluntary organisations, by third sector organisations, and the Cabinet Secretary has already mentioned that and paid tribute to them. They also are valuable in that they provide feedback from the grassroots, and some very valuable information comes from them. Yet, at times when finances are not as available as others, they find themselves at the end of long funding chains, and sometimes the cuts can be concentrated on the third sector organisations. In fact, in evidence that we've been given in the report on services for disabled children by the Scottish Commissioner for Children and Young People, found that 80% of third sector organisations they contacted reported a cut in funding and a requirement to make efficiency savings. Are there any streams identified in the budget that may help organisations like that?
The government, it's an exercise that I'm taking forward just now, just to coalesce the various funding streams that the government makes available of its own, the resources that we control, to third sector organisations. I often come to particularly the Equal Opportunities Committee, and members ask me to present the budget in one fashion, reflecting, well, if I come to Equal Opportunities to reflect equalities issues, if I go to the Rural Affairs Committee, they'll ask me to present it in terms of climate change. If I go to the Finance Committee, they'll say to me, just leave it the way you present it. We can quite follow that. Don't go chopping and changing it. So there's different ways in which we can present budget information, and I'm conscious that the way we do it doesn't always give the answer to the type of question that Mr Johnson is raising. And so if I look, for example, at the one third sector line in the budget, which is in my portfolio, it sits at £24.5 million. It sat there at that in 13-14, it will be that in 14-15, and it's projected to be that in 15-16, which I think demonstrates that in a very difficult financial climate, the government at its strategic third sector level interaction is maintaining the resources that we're putting into the third sector. Having said that, in the health, justice, rural affairs, culture and education portfolios, there will be very significant third sector funding support that is made available, and particularly my colleagues in the education and health fields will be presiding over strategic funding support that's made available to some of the principal organisations that provide support to young people with disabilities. So I'm confident that there are strong funding streams available across a number of different portfolios. On Mr Johnson's wider observation about the funding position of third sector organisations, I would want to put on record the fact that I think the agenda the government has taken forward on public service reform actually opens up opportunities for third sector organisations to be participants in the delivery of public services. As an emphatic part of our reform agenda. Indeed, at the event that I was at in Clackmannan last night, the public sector was able to demonstrate a whole host of programmes, particularly on the occasion, the example that's been cited last night, the two examples that have been cited last night were on employability and on drug and alcohol addiction, where public services literally could not be provided without the contribution being made by third sector organisations. So there will be, even beyond flows of grant funding, there will be revenue funding that authorities are putting in place to purchase services from third sector organisations that form an integral part of how we deliver public services. And that's exactly the model that I have been trying to create, so that we sustain the third sector in the future, not by grant funding alone, but we sustained it by revenue generation, principally through the creation of strong and embedded social enterprises that can provide some important services, but also, to go back to the point that Mr Mason was raising with me, some important employment opportunities for people themselves with disabilities.
What you appear to be saying is that the funding chains are shortening. Is there a point in this process where we will be able to identify exactly how much resource being fed through the third sector route is being used for things like aids and adaptations, travel, housing for disabled people, supporting independent living and so on.
Certainly on aids and adaptations, I certainly think I can assist the committee with some of that if I can find the right page in my briefing pack, which I saw earlier on today, but I'll maybe have to talk about something else while I try to find it. But certainly the independent living point, I made a comment to Yvonne McMahon earlier on about the continuity that the government intends to deploy in that respect, and we will endeavour to do so. And I think the type of approaches that we take forward in supporting different organisations through the funding that we make available to a range of organisations focused on disability, which we take forward as a government, are designed to provide all the necessary support that individuals could require. And we have a number of strategic relationships with organisations like Inclusion Scotland, Independent Living in Scotland, the Scottish Disability Equality Forum, the Equality Fund. These are all organisations that are designed to try to address the issues that Mr Johnson raises. But I would concede that we haven't got an amalgamated position of all the funding streams that are going to the third sector, but that's work that the government is currently undertaking.
Thank you.
I asked the Cabinet Secretary a question about the funding aspect while you're looking for that information. Third sector organisations and also organisations like community transport and also training providers, they're all funded on an annual basis. And that actually makes it very difficult for these organisations to forward plan, discuss things like renting new premises, and these organisations coming up to the end of their yearly contract issue their staff with like 3 months notice, which obviously creates a feeling of insecurity for the organisations and the individuals concerned. Would the Cabinet Secretary consider in the future, the near future, to look at longer contracts for these organisations?
This is an important issue, Convener, and you may recall the debate that we had in Parliament, which was initiated by the Conservatives, on the issue of 3-year funding for third sector organisations. And in response to that debate, I commissioned some research and survey work which was to explore the extent to which we had 3-year funding and how that could be become a more embedded practice. If I look at the funding settlements that we put in place, if we go back, for example, to 2011, and when I set out the spending review in 2011, I set out 3 years of financial information, 12-13, a budget for 12-13 and indicative plans for 13-14 and 14-15. Now, I accept that the indicative plans are not a hard and fast, absolutely nailed down certain budget for organisations, but they're a pretty good indicator of the direction of travel. Now, if I look back with the benefit of hindsight over 13-14, and I look at what we're doing in 14-15, these budgets, as we get closer to implementing them, are pretty much what I set out in the indicative plans. So my point is that an organisation, a local authority or a health board, could look at their indicative plans in 2011, see a 3-year pattern and give a commitment to external organisations, in my view, that was reliably founded. In the course of the last few months, I've had to wrestle with quite significant reductions, in-year reductions in budget plans that I had applied by the UK government. I've not passed any of those reductions on to local government, for example, none of them. So our budget went down by 125 million. None of that reduction has been passed on to local government. So I think external organisations should be able to give, where the Scottish Government gives 3 years of financial information to organisations, I think local authorities and other bodies should be able to share that information as well with third sector organisations. And of course it can be caveated with a clause which says dependent on the final money that we get. Of course that's a reasonable caveat, but I don't think there's anything instinctively to stop that being set out. The research we've carried out is currently being assessed and evaluated and being discussed between different interested parties, the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, the COSLA, and also the CARE organisation, whose acronym escapes me just now, with their Chief Executive Annie Gunnar-Logan, and we are so we're going through the evaluation of that research just now, and once I have a clearer position of what that research says, I'll share that with Parliament.
So can you just sort of clarify then, you're saying that the funding that you allocate to local government, you look at like a 3-year plan for it. If you're doing that for local government, I'm assuming then you're also looking at it then for when you directly fund to training providers then that deliver the modern apprenticeship programme and also the other programmes for individuals that are furthest away from work, because they're just now on just a yearly contract?
It depends, Convener, on some of the funding streams that will be used. On some of the programmes that you're talking about may well be funded, for example, by European funding, which we may not necessarily have for a 3-year period. So there may be limitations in the allocations that we can make in that respect. But the point I'm making is that where we have 3-year financial information, I think we should be able to give a 3-year picture to organisations. Now, where we are just now, we've got essentially 2 years of forward financial information, so I think we should be working to give as much clarity as we possibly can do to local organisations.
Thank you. I may come back with a supplementary in a moment or two, but at the moment, can I pass you on to Christian, who'd like to ask a question about welfare reform?
Thank you very much. Welfare reform, you talked about it in your introduction, and you've not stopped talking about it since you answered the question of the committee. And you'll be pleased to hear that witnesses in front of us did say that they welcome very much the action of the Scottish Government to mitigate the effect of the welfare reform. They were particularly incensed about the bedroom tax and the effect it has on the different people they represented. They maybe suggested that how much it was welcome. We would like to see how the Scottish Government, and we understand that the Scottish Government cannot, haven't got the powers to replace who amend the benefits, but I would like to have some of your comments regarding their concerns about the few years ahead of welfare reform cuts.
The committee will be aware the government has taken a number of steps to try to mitigate the effects of welfare reform. Those have been mainly anchored around the expansion of advisory services to individuals who require advice and support, the introduction of the council tax reduction scheme, which has protected individuals against cuts in council tax benefit, the establishment of the Scottish Welfare Fund, which has been a major part of the propositions that we've put in place, and then of course also the steps that we've taken to mitigate the effect of the bedroom tax, where of course we have to operate within our legislative competence in this respect, and we have done that to the maximum of the ability available to us. But as I indicated in my response, I think, to Yvonne McMahon earlier on, it will be difficult for the government to ameliorate all of the impacts of welfare reform in Scotland.
Thank you very much for your answer. But we have that particular concern about the bedroom tax, and particularly the consequences when we talk about local authorities who are making, for instance, they are making the additional funding being used to mitigate welfare racial conditional on DLA payments, and taking into account the respect of discretionary housing payments. And how could you encourage local authorities not to target people with disability in this context?
I'm not sure I'm sufficiently familiar with the point that's been raised by Mr. relates to some of the decision-making approaches that will be taken by individual local authorities in terms of the interaction between discretionary housing payments and DLA. If that's the point, I'm not sure I'm sufficiently cited on what the issue is there. So if I can take that away and respond directly to the committee as to what the issue happens to be, but there will be a basis upon which discretionary housing payments can be made available. I would have to check just what the interaction is with, in terms of the guidance that we've set out with DLA. But if I can do that, I'll come back to the committee on that point.
Good. Thank you very much.
Can we have Yvonne McMahon now, please, to ask a question?
Thank you. It's just to follow up on the 20 million that the Scottish Government have made available, and as Christian has said, that was very welcomed by the witnesses. However, they wish to go further, and I understand that in evidence to the Welfare Reform Committee, Danny Alexander put forward that the Scottish Government could set up their own hardship fund from the block grant to cover people affected by the bedroom tax. Have you considered that approach, and would it be feasible to give more money?
Well, I don't know quite what Danny Alexander is meaning by what he's suggesting. It's beyond me to know what he's talking about, because the law is very, very clear here that if we try to ameliorate the effects of the bedroom tax in any other way other than by using discretionary housing payments, we will be in breach of the law. And so somebody would have to explain to me what Danny Alexander's talking about, because I don't understand it. The law is crystal clear to me that this is a reserved issue, and there is and if we try to make a payment to compensate an individual on a benefit issue, we will be in breach of the law. So I'm very happy to consider whatever Danny Alexander's going on about, but that's my understanding of the law.
You couldn't set up a hardship fund, is what you're saying?
That's my. My view would be that would be in contravention of the law.
Okay,
for me to do so.
Thank you very much. We're moving on now to climate change, and Marco Biaggi would like to ask a question.
Thank you. The changes in climate will have major effects in Scotland, in particular in severe winters and more frequent flooding. Is there any way to be sure from our funding streams into those areas that disabled people who are especially vulnerable in terms of being able to respond, recover in flooding situations or in severe weather situations are getting the level of protection and benefit from those funding streams that we intend?
I think the best way to answer this, I think, is in relation to the first of all in dealing with emergency situations where individuals may be in jeopardy because of what is happening. And if I go back in my experience of being involved in dealing with major examples of flooding and severe weather implications, one of the when the whole resilience operation cranks up, when we've got an incident like this, there is a particular focus on vulnerable individuals, and the strategic coordinating groups at local level, which are anchored in our local authority activities, essentially are teed up to identify any individual with any vulnerability in any circumstance. Now, there will be examples of that in a flooding situation, clearly. an individual with disabilities, it's absolutely vital that we understand where they are, what support we can give them and how we can assist them, literally, physically, in some of these circumstances. In severe weather instances, I've been involved in substantial work that's been taken forward to ensure that in severe weather, the individuals who perhaps required heating support were given that at different stages. Where we've had severe weather instances, local authority workers have been going round with different oil-based heating implements when we've had power cuts and for houses where people have got disabilities and vulnerabilities. So I think in that emergency situation, I would want to assure the committee that one of the priorities of the resilience operation is to make sure that anyone with vulnerabilities is properly supported and assisted. There is a very proactive level of consideration we've got to give to this, and that is about how we plan accommodation and settlements that people may live in with disabilities, and in circumstances where we may be looking at developing a particular supported accommodation, there should be very sophisticated planning going into what is the correct and appropriate location for that. So there are, I think, in a range of different ways, the particular needs and the particular interests of people with disabilities are reflected in those decisions.
Are there statistics available for the provision of support for energy efficiency through home energy efficiency programmes Scotland to households with a person with a disability? And if there are, could you provide them to the committee in writing later?
I'll need to check if we have a disaggregation of those statistics, but I'll check them. And if we have, well, whatever we have, I'll check it out and come back to the committee. I think what I would accept, and I made this remark in my opening statement, is that I think our information base needs to be enhanced on many of the aspects of information that we hold here. But we'll certainly explore that point.
Thank you very much. John Finney would now like to ask some questions about rural areas.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, the challenges of delivering public services in rural areas are well known. Last year, Citizens Advice Scotland produced a report which was titled "Rural Scots Suffer More/Most from Welfare Cuts." And, excuse me, with regard to that, suggested, and I quote here, "Unemployed and disabled people in rural areas are suffering more than most," and this related to the cuts from the UK benefit system. Is there anything that you could point to in the Scottish budget that would particularly address that area?
There's a fascinating dichotomy in all of this about rural areas. That as Mr Finney will know, I represent a large rural area, as he does. And what strikes me when I look at the more isolated parts of my constituency, and then when I look at isolated parts of the area that Mr Finney represents, there is the arguments around focused collaborative working by public sector organisations together become more obvious the more rural and isolated an area becomes, because it becomes more obvious that it's more difficult to provide services in far-flung places. So therefore, making sure that everything joins up, everything's linked up, that in some parts of the country, as I've seen in isolated areas, people are perhaps doing 3 or 4 different jobs to make a living. That all comes together to ensure there is a cohesion around the delivery of services and opportunities in localities. And that is very much the ethos that's at the heart of our approach to public service reform, where we are encouraging a greater focus on place, whether that place is a city the size of Inverness or a settlement the size of Acoltebui. It's about what can be done and achieved within these settlements and these communities. So therefore, when it comes to trying to find opportunities to involve people with disabilities in wider strands of society, particularly in employment, how we get organisations to work together, how we create new opportunities through, for example, social enterprise activity, which is often, in my experience, much more sustainable in rural and isolated areas than it can be in more urban areas. That approach contains some of the methods and mechanisms by which we can try to address the need for opportunities for these individuals.
Two of the challenges relate to transport as a perennial challenge, and perhaps more directly at the moment linked with, again, with the UK government's welfare cuts is broadband, where of course there is the requirement for people to be using that to... Anything in the budget you could point to there, on specifically on both of these that would...
Well, the broadband funding that the government is making available is really heavily weighted to rural areas. That's essentially the challenge. And Mr Biaggi's constituency will not be benefiting terribly much from what the Scottish Government's doing on broadband development, because I think the citizens of Edinburgh Central will be well looked after, I think, by by the investment that is made by different telecom companies. I see he's shaking his head, so I've obviously put my foot in it with that remark. So the focus of our investment is essentially about addressing the clear deficiencies that will emerge in the availability of broadband in hard-to-reach locations, and because we accept the fundamental importance of connectivity within the country. Now, that's important in a whole variety of different ways, in how people live their lives nowadays, in how businesses operate, but it's crucially relevant in how we operate public services. And I was discussing this issue with the Convention of the Highlands and Islands just on Monday. It's all very well for us to talk about the importance of delivering digital public services and to find ways in which public service workers can use all the devices that we now have at our disposal to deliver public services and to communicate directly about the impact of public services. But if you can't get a mobile phone signal or you can't get access to broadband, it's all a bit academic. So actually ensuring that effective connectivity is absolutely vital for these areas, and that's really at the heart of the government's focus on its in the broadband expenditure. On the issue of transport, there are a whole range of different third sector ventures emerging of a community transport character, which are very flexible, deployed to meet the needs of communities in isolated areas, and obviously the government is keen to do what it can to support those organisations as best we can.
I wonder, may I go back to self-directed support, Convener, please? Just picking up on self-directed support again, and the issue I think my colleague Yvonne Mahan raised, Cabinet Secretary, about concerns there would be that personal assistance would be on 0 hours contracts. And absolutely accepting an area that you've covered several times during this, and that is not wishing to intrude on local authority territory as regards expenditure. Is there any system that you could put in place to ensure that public money isn't dispersed to people who aren't good employers, who are not ensuring that workers have proper terms and conditions? Is there anything directly or indirectly you can do to ensure that's the case? Because clearly we don't want to, the supporters of self-directed support see the benefits, but if the benefits is taking jobs away from properly remunerated public sector workers and replacing that to poorly remunerated public sector personal assistance, that doesn't seem to me to be a win for anyone.
The procurement reform bill, which the government has taken forward, is the mechanism by which we are determined to try to tackle these issues and to put in as much good employment practice as we possibly can do. Issues of employment regulation are clearly reserved matters, but there are aspects of the procurement regime that we can try to apply conditions and constraints that fulfil some of the aspirations that Mr Finney is raising. So that would be the principal vehicle by which we would try to take forward that agenda.
Very much.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any other questions they'd like to ask the Cabinet Secretary? No. Could I just go back on to the third sector question again and ask, is there a danger that organisations become service providers dependent on their funding from the government and local authorities, and they really can no longer act as advocates for those individuals that they support?
I suppose there is that danger, Convener. Yes, I would have to concede that. I think I remember being involved in a debate in Parliament about the third sector, and I think I took issue with your colleague Mrs McDougall about an issue where I took from her comment that it was essentially this point that it was a bad thing for third sector organisations to be delivering public services. I'm maybe perhaps paraphrasing her remarks a bit too far. I actually am very keen for third sector organisations to be delivering public services, because I think actually, in my experience, they can do a very good job in delivering that crucially person-centred approach. One of the dangers of public services is that we deliver public services as programmes. You know, I do my bit as a healthcare worker, you can do your bit as a local authority worker, and we don't actually think about the individual and what their needs are and what their rounded needs are. And my experience in a lot of third sector involvement, it is a much more holistic view of the individual that is taken than is often taken by the public services. So for that reason, I think it would be a good thing for third sector organisations to be more involved in delivery of public services. Now, of course, the organisations have got advocacy roles and responsibilities. Some will not be interested in being public service delivery organisations because they want to be advocacy organisations, and and that's entirely appropriate. I suppose the issue is about where have you got if you've got hybrid organisations, do they lose some of their ability to champion issues if they are in fact part of the delivery mechanisms? But I certainly wouldn't want the committee to think anything other than the fact that I'm pursuing a strategy which is designed to get the third sector more actively involved in the delivery of public services, because I think that would be a good thing for our public services and for the individuals that rely upon them.
Thank you for that. But it'd be worthwhile maybe bearing in mind that if there could be something put in place that would give those service providers the confidence that if they felt they wanted to criticise the funding provider, they wouldn't feel as if their contracts would be reduced or taken off them in the years to come.
I think that's a very fair observation, Convener, and I think that's I take your point in the way that you express it there, that organisations may feel compromised that they can't criticise their paymaster, and we distribute lots of money to organisations that criticise us, so it doesn't seem to stop people. But I take the point very seriously.
Okay, thank you very much for your contribution today, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the public part of today's meeting. Our next meeting will take place on Thursday, the 7th of November, and will be in private. I now suspend the meeting for the committee to move into private session.